She had been cleaning that office for 10 years. Every Monday morning, before the attorneys arrived, before the phone started ringing, before anyone who mattered was watching, Eleanor was already there, straightening the blinds, replacing the flowers on the senior partner's desk, making sure the place looked like the kind of firm that cared about the details. Nobody thanked her. Not really. Not the junior partners who looked through her. Not the receptionist who once asked her to use the freight elevator so the clients wouldn't see her in the lobby. Not the man's own children, who swept through twice a year at Christmas, trailing expensive coats and the particular impatience of people who have never had to wait for anything. But Charles Whitfield thanked her. Every single morning. By name. For 10 years. And when Charles Whitfield died on a quiet Thursday in March, he left behind a will that no one in that family saw coming. By the time the attorneys finished reading it, his daughter had knocked over her water glass. His son had stood up and then sat back down twice without saying a word. And Eleanor, sitting in the one chair they'd offered her almost as an afterthought at the end of the table, was holding a handkerchief to her face, trying not to cry in front of people who had never once learned her last name. What Charles had left her wasn't just a gesture. It was a decision. And what happened in that conference room over the next 2 hours is the kind of thing people are still talking about. Before we dive deeper, let us know in the comments where you're watching from. We'd love to hear from you. And don't forget to hit that subscribe button so you never miss any of our upcoming videos. Eleanor May Briggs had turned 62 the previous November. She had not made a fuss about it. That was not her way. She had worked in service her entire adult life. First as a hotel maid in her 20s, then as a school cafeteria worker for a decade, then as a private housekeeper for a family in Alexandria who moved away in 2009 and left her without a reference, which was the kind of thing that happened to women like Eleanor and was not considered particularly remarkable by anyone except Eleanor herself. She had come to Whitfield and Associates 12 years ago through a cleaning agency. The contract was for 2 mornings a week. Within a year, the agency had expanded her to full 5-day service because the firm's regular janitorial company kept sending different people. And Charles Whitfield, who believed that consistency was the foundation of every functioning institution, had specifically requested her by name. That was the first time anyone in a position like his had done that for her. She remembered the exact moment. She had been emptying the trash beside his office door when his assistant, a thin, efficient woman named Patricia, had come to find her and said, almost as an afterthought, "Mr. Whitfield asked that you be assigned to this floor specifically. He said, and I'm quoting, that you do the work with care." Eleanor had nodded and said thank you and gone back to the trash. But she had thought about it for the entire drive home. In 12 years, she had learned the rhythms of the building the way you learn the rhythms of a person you live with. She knew which attorneys drank their coffee before removing their coats. She knew which paralegals ate lunch at their desks and which ones disappeared for exactly 45 minutes and came back quieter. She knew that the third-floor conference room always smelled faintly of mildew after rain because the window seal had never been properly replaced, and she had mentioned it to the facilities manager twice and been politely ignored both times. She knew that Charles Whitfield arrived at 7:15 every morning except Fridays, when he came in at 8 o'clock because he stopped at the bakery on the corner and brought in a box of pastries that he left in the break room without putting his name on them, though everyone knew. She knew this because she was always already there when he arrived, and she knew that he was the only person in that building, in 12 years, who had learned her granddaughter's name. Her name was Brianna. She was 9 years old. She liked drawing horses. Charles had asked about her approximately once a month since Eleanor had mentioned her offhandedly 3 years ago, and Eleanor had stopped being surprised by it and started simply being grateful, the way you become grateful for things that should be ordinary and aren't. Charles Whitfield was 71 years old and had built Whitfield and Associates from a 2-person practice in a rented suite above a dry cleaner in 1987 into one of the most respected estate law firms in Virginia. He was not a man who made speeches. He was not the kind of attorney who enjoyed the theater of courtrooms. He worked in wills and trusts and estate planning, which is the quiet end of law, the part that deals with what people leave behind and who they trust to carry it forward. He believed this was, in its own way, the most honest work an attorney could do, because by the time the document was read, The person who wrote it could not revise it or explain themselves or soften any of its implications. A will was a person's final, unedited sentence. Charles took that seriously. He had been married for 34 years to a woman named Ruth, who had died of a stroke 6 years before the events of this story. They had 2 children, a daughter named Carolyn, 51, who lived in Connecticut and ran a nonprofit that she described at dinner parties in terms that made the cause sound important without ever quite being specific enough to verify, and a son named Mitchell, 47, who had spent the last 8 years trying to launch a series of businesses that had in common only the fact that they had all required capital from Charles and had all, eventually, not worked out. Charles loved his children. He had never stopped loving them. But he had, in the years after Ruth died, come to understand something about them that saddened him in the particular way that truth is sometimes sad, that they had grown into people who related to the world primarily through what they expected from it. He had seen it at Ruth's funeral, not in the grief, which was real, in the small things. The way Carolyn had asked Patricia within 48 hours whether she knew anything about the estate timeline. The way Mitchell had arrived 2 days late because of a business meeting and spent the reception on his phone. He had not said anything. What was there to say? What Charles had done in the years following Ruth's death was pay attention differently. He had begun noticing who in his life showed up consistently, without an audience, without anything to gain. He began noticing, in a language his profession had trained him to use, who was trustworthy. Eleanor had always been there, not because she was paid to be, though she was, but because she did the work the same way whether anyone was watching or not. He had tested this, though he never told anyone he had, arriving unexpectedly early on mornings when she didn't know he was coming and finding the work done with the same quiet care he always found. He had asked her opinion once, casually, on a decision he was considering, whether to expand the firm's pro bono estate work for low-income families who died without proper documentation. He had framed it as a throwaway question, the kind you ask a person to make conversation. Eleanor had thought about it for a moment, still holding her mop, and said, "People who have nothing think they have nothing to leave. But they leave things. Somebody should help with that." Charles had expanded the pro bono practice that year. He had never told Eleanor that her answer was the thing that settled it for him. He had told his attorney, however, when they revised the will. Now, before we get to what happened in that conference room, there's something Charles did, a quiet thing, about 18 months before he died, that changes how you understand everything that came after. It was a Tuesday in October. Eleanor had finished the 3rd floor and was working her way down the hall toward Charles's office when she noticed his door was slightly open. This was unusual. He always kept it closed when he was meeting with anyone, and he was clearly meeting with someone. She could hear voices. She would have kept walking. That was her practice. What happened in the offices was not her concern. But as she passed, she heard her own name. She did not stop walking. She did not press herself against the wall the way it happens in films. She kept her pace even and her eyes forward and rounded the corner, and she stood there for a moment with her cart, her heart doing something she didn't quite have a name for. She had heard only a fragment. She did not know the context. The voice that had spoken her name was Charles's, and what he had said was, "And Eleanor, if she'll accept it, though I suspect she'll try to give it back," which is exactly the kind of person she is. She had finished her shift and gone home and made dinner for Brianna and not mentioned it to anyone. She told herself it was probably nothing. A reference, perhaps. A small acknowledgement of long service. She had not been wrong exactly. It just wasn't small. She didn't find out what it was until the Thursday in March when the call came. Charles Whitfield died on a Thursday morning in March at 7:40 a.m. before Eleanor had finished the 2nd floor. He had arrived at his usual time, 7:15, stopped in the hallway outside the break room where she was restocking the supply shelf, and said, "Good morning, Eleanor. How's Brianna?" She had told him Brianna had won 2nd place in a drawing contest at school. He had smiled and said, "2nd place with horses is still 1st place in my book." Then he had walked to his office and closed the door. Those were the last words Eleanor heard him say. Patricia had found him at 7:42, slumped in his chair, his reading glasses still in his hand. The paramedics arrived within 6 minutes. They did everything they could. It had been a massive heart attack, fast, the kind that doesn't negotiate. The building went quiet in the way buildings go quiet when something irreversible has happened. People stood in doorways. Someone cried in the copy room. The paralegals who had worked there longest sat at their desks without moving for a long time. Eleanor found out from Patricia, who came to find her in the hallway the way she had 12 years ago, when she first told Eleanor that Charles had asked for her specifically. Patricia said it plainly, because Patricia was a woman who understood that kindness was sometimes in the plainness. She touched Eleanor's arm and said, "He's gone, Eleanor. Just now. I thought you should hear it from someone who knew you'd want to know." Eleanor stood in the hallway with her cart and did not say anything for a moment. Then she said, "He said Brianna's horses deserved first place." Patricia, who had worked for Charles for 19 years and thought she was beyond surprises where he was concerned, had to press her lips together. "That sounds like him," she said. Eleanor had finished her shift. She didn't know what else to do. Charles would have wanted the work done. She found out about the will 3 weeks later. The call came from an attorney named James Okafor, a partner at an outside firm that Charles had retained specifically to handle his personal estate. He told Eleanor that she had been named in the will and asked whether she would be available to attend the reading the following Tuesday. Eleanor had said, "I'm sorry. Am I in the right conversation?" James Okafor had said, very gently, "Yes, Ms. Briggs. You are." The reading was held in a conference room on the 4th floor of Whitfield and Associates, which was the floor where Charles's office was, and which Eleanor had cleaned every Monday, Wednesday, and Friday for 12 years. She knew this room. She knew the window that stuck in humidity. She knew the scratch on the far end of the mahogany table that someone had tried to cover with a coaster and never quite succeeded. She knew the smell of it in the morning before the air conditioning came on. She had never sat in it before. She arrived 10 minutes early, which was her habit, and was shown to a chair at the end of the table by a young associate she didn't recognize. The chair was at the far end, away from the head of the table, which was fine. Eleanor was not a person who required particular positioning. Carolyn arrived 7 minutes later. She was dressed in a dark blazer and the kind of controlled composure that Eleanor had learned over a lifetime of working in rooms where she was not quite supposed to be, to recognize as grief that had been organized into something more manageable. She did not look at Eleanor when she came in, or rather, she looked at her the way people look at fixtures. Her eyes passed over Eleanor and moved on, cataloging the room for the people who mattered in it. She chose the seat directly to the right of the head of the table. Mitchell arrived 4 minutes after Carolyn, loosening his tie as he walked through the door, the practiced casualness of a man who wanted it noted that he had places to be. He took the seat across from his sister, glanced around the table, let his eyes land briefly on Eleanor, and then looked away in the same motion. James Okafor arrived last. He was a composed man in his late 50s, the kind of attorney who had delivered difficult news enough times to have developed a particular quality of stillness about him. Not cold, just steady. He set down his briefcase, opened it, placed a folder on the table, and looked around the room. He thanked everyone for coming. He said Charles had been a respected colleague and a thorough man who had been very clear about his intentions. Then he opened the folder and began to read. The first portions of the will were what Carolyn and Mitchell had expected. Charles's personal effects, divided evenly. His car to Mitchell, his library to Carolyn, who he noted had always had more patience for books than her brother, which drew a small, automatic smile from her that she then appeared to regret. A significant contribution to the pro bono estate fund he had built. Severance packages for every long-term staff member, personally calculated. Charitable gifts to 4 organizations. And then James Okafor looked up briefly, just once before continuing. It was a small thing, but Eleanor noticed it. She held her handkerchief in her lap and waited. James Okafor read the next portion of the will the same way he had read everything before it, clearly, without theatrical emphasis, the way a careful man reads something that does not require drama to land. He read that Charles Whitfield was bequeathing the building at 1140 Garfield Street, the building that housed Whitfield and Associates, which he had purchased outright in 2003 and which had been valued most recently at $4.2 million, to Eleanor May Briggs. He also read that Charles was leaving Eleanor a trust of $350,000, designated for Eleanor's personal use and for the education of her granddaughter, Brianna. He read that Charles had written the following, and he was quoting directly from the document. Eleanor Briggs has worked in this building longer than most of my staff. In that time, she has done her work with more consistency, more care, and more quiet dignity than I have managed to sustain in my own life. I have had occasion to observe, over many years, how differently people treat those they believe to be below them. Eleanor has never treated anyone below her because she does not appear to organize the world that way. I consider this a form of wisdom I have tried, with limited success, to learn from. The building is hers. She has, in every way that matters, already earned it. The room was quiet. Carolyn's water glass tipped. She caught it before it fell entirely, but not before a small arc of water crossed the table. She set it upright and pressed a napkin to the surface and did not look up. Mitchell stood, then sat back down, then stood again and walked to the window and stood there with his back to the room, his hands in his pockets, his shoulders doing the particular work of a person who is composing themselves in public and knows it. Eleanor sat at the end of the table with her handkerchief pressed to her face. She was thinking about Brianna. She was thinking about the morning 3 years ago when she had mentioned the child to Charles almost by accident. She had been distracted, worried because Brianna had been sick for 3 days and Eleanor's daughter was a single mother who couldn't afford to miss work. Charles had noticed the distraction and asked about it simply, the way a person asks when they actually want to know. And she had told him. And he had said, "How old is she?" And Eleanor had said 9. And he had said, 9 is a good age for horses. And she thought about the fact that he had been, in that moment and in all the moments like it since, simply kind. Not strategic. Not performing generosity. Just kind, the way some people are, the way that rarer kind of person moves through the world. She had not been prepared to sit in a room and be told he had left her everything he'd built it on. James Okafor waited a respectful amount of time before he continued. His daughter spoke next, and what she said made James Okafor put down his pen. Carolyn spoke first. She spoke carefully, which was more frightening than if she hadn't. She said that she had the deepest respect for Eleanor and that she was not in any way questioning her father's feelings, but that a bequest of this nature, a primary asset, a revenue-generating property, was a significant legal and financial matter, and she felt it was important to understand the full context of the document's preparation. She said the word context the way people use it when they mean something else. James Okafor had set his pen down, not because he was surprised he had anticipated this exact exchange, but because he wanted both hands free for what came next. He said that the will had been prepared 18 months prior to Charles's death, that Charles had been assessed by 2 independent physicians as fully competent at the time of signing, that the document had been witnessed, notarized, and reviewed by outside counsel, specifically to anticipate challenges. He said that he had advised Charles of the likelihood of exactly this conversation, and Charles had said, without particular emotion, "I know. Do it right, so Eleanor doesn't have to fight for it." Carolyn absorbed this. Her expression moved through several things before settling. Mitchell turned from the window. He had collected himself, which made him more controlled and therefore more dangerous in the way that controlled people in financial situations sometimes are. He said he was sure the document was valid. He was not disputing the document. What he was questioning, he said, was whether this was really what their father had intended, whether this was a momentary decision, an emotional response to his grief after their mother, rather than a considered. James Okafor interrupted him. Quietly, he said that Charles had reviewed and reaffirmed the will on 3 separate occasions over the 18 months following its initial preparation. He said that on the most recent occasion, 6 weeks before Charles died, Charles had added a handwritten addendum that James was now also required to read aloud. The room went still again. James Okafor lifted a second, smaller sheet and read, "If you are asking whether I was certain, I was. If you are asking whether I thought about this carefully, I thought about almost nothing else in the last 2 years. If you're asking whether Eleanor deserves this, I am not sure deserving is the right word. I think some things are simply right. This is one of them. Mitchell sat back down. Carolyn looked at the table for a long time. And then she looked at Eleanor, really looked at her, perhaps for the first time since she had walked through the door, and said something that nobody in the room had expected her to say. She said, "What was he like? At work? In the mornings? What was he actually like when we weren't there?" The question caught Eleanor off guard. She lowered her handkerchief. She thought about it for a moment the way she thought about most things, completely, before she spoke. Then she said, "He was the same as he was every other time. He was the same person whether you were watching or not." Carolyn looked at the table again. She said, "I think I always knew that. I just didn't know that I knew it." Mitchell didn't say anything, but he nodded once, which was something. Eleanor had not planned what she was going to say. She had not planned to say anything. But after the room had settled and James Okafor had asked whether she had any questions about the documents, she had said, "I need to think about this." And then, after a moment, she had said, "Can I ask something?" James had said, "Of course." Eleanor said, "The people who work in this building, the staff, the paralegals, the junior attorneys, Charles's arrangements for them, are they secure? That's not affected by any of this." James confirmed that the staff provisions were separate and fully funded. Eleanor nodded. She folded her handkerchief once. Then she said, "Then I'd like to talk to someone about what it means to own a building. Because I don't know what that means yet. But I know what Charles thought it should mean, and I know what I think it should mean, and I think those are probably the same thing." James Okafor, who had been a practicing attorney for 31 years, said later that it was one of the most precise statements of intent he had ever heard a beneficiary make in a first reading. She had also, true to Charles's prediction, asked once whether there was a way to give some of it back. Specifically, whether a meaningful portion of the trust could be redirected to the pro bono fund. James had said that was entirely within her rights. She had said, "Good, let's do that." Then she had stood, shaken James Okafor's hand, and thanked Carolyn and Mitchell for being there. Carolyn had stood too, which she hadn't planned to do. She shook Eleanor's hand and said, "He talked about your granddaughter. At Thanksgiving, I think. He mentioned her horses." Eleanor had looked at her for a moment. "Her name is Brianna," she said. Carolyn said, "I know. He told us." Eleanor held that. She hadn't known he'd told them. "Thank you," she said, "for telling me that." Eleanor did not move into Charles's office. She said later, when a local journalist who had somehow gotten wind of the story asked her about it, that she didn't feel like that was where she needed to be. What she needed was to understand what she had, and then to figure out how to use it correctly. She spent 6 weeks working with James Okafor and a financial advisor he recommended. She kept Whitfield and Associates in the building on a standard lease. She redirected a portion of Charles's trust to the pro bono estate fund, as she had said she would, and she funded a second tranche that specifically served elderly individuals and domestic workers navigating inheritance without documentation, a population she knew personally because she was part of it. She named it the Ruth Whitfield Fund, after Charles's wife. She called Carolyn before she finalized the name and asked whether that was all right. Carolyn had been quiet on the phone for a moment. Then she said, "My mother would have liked you very much." For Brianna, Eleanor set aside the full education trust Charles had designated. She told Brianna that a kind man she had worked for had believed her drawings were important enough to invest in. She did not say more than that. Brianna was 9. There would be time to explain the rest. She kept her job. This was the thing that surprised people most. She remained on the cleaning rotation for Whitfield and Associates, though she adjusted her hours, and she continued doing the 4th floor, Charles's floor, the same way she always had. Patricia, who had stayed on to manage the transition, asked her once if she was sure that was what she wanted. Eleanor said, "I'm good at this work, and this building matters. Why would I leave?" It was generally agreed, the most unusual property owner in the building's history. She was also the first one in 30 years who had ever had the window seal on the 3rd floor conference room properly fixed. 3 months after the will reading, on a Monday morning, Eleanor arrived at the building at her usual time. She had a key now. She had always had a key, but now it was a different kind of key, and she let herself in through the front entrance the way she always had and took the elevator to the 4th floor. The building was quiet. It was 6:45. No one else was there yet. She did Charles's floor first, the way she always had. His office was being used now by a senior partner named Elaine, who had brought in her own plants and her own framed photographs, which was right. The room should be used. Charles would not have wanted it kept as a monument. But there was still the window, the one that faced east, the one Charles had always left the blind up on because he liked the light in the morning. Eleanor straightened it, which she didn't need to do anymore, but did anyway because some habits are not about necessity. She thought about what he had said in the will, that she did the work with care, that she did not organize the world by who was above or below. She thought about the fact that he had been watching all those years, and she had not known he was watching, and she had done the work the same way regardless. She thought that was the whole point. That was what he had been paying attention to. Not the work itself, but the consistency of the person doing it. She finished the 4th floor and moved downstairs. On the way out, she passed the 3rd floor conference room and looked in through the glass. The new window seal was clean and tight. The room smelled right. Someone had replaced the chair at the far end, the one she had always thought was slightly too low for the table, with a chair that matched the others. It was a small thing. She stood there for a moment with her card in the hallway and looked at the room that had always been there and was now quietly hers. Then she moved on. There was still work to do. Charles Whitfield did not leave Eleanor that building because she was exceptional. He left it to her because she was consistent, and he had lived long enough to understand that consistency, the quiet, unwitnessed kind, is rarer and more valuable than almost anything else. He had seen, in 12 years of watching someone do ordinary work with extraordinary care, what it looks like when a person brings their full self to something, regardless of whether anyone is paying attention. Eleanor hadn't been performing. She hadn't known anyone was looking. She had just been herself, every single morning, and it had turned out that being exactly and entirely yourself, without an audience, without reward, without any particular expectation that it would be noticed, is sometimes the most powerful thing a person can do. If this story stayed with you, we'd love to know why. Leave a comment below. And if you know someone who does the quiet work, who shows up every day without making a fuss about it, share this with them. They deserve to hear it. We'll see you in the next one.